Yeah, I was going to mention the Heller article. You should go and check it out. You happen to remember which issue that was? The spring issue of Quest, which, by the way, is really quite an interesting magazine. It belongs to the Theosophical Society, but it is by no means sort of dusty 19th century theosophy. It's got a lot of good stuff in it. And Stephen Heller is... he is a bishop of the Ecclesia Gnostica, not the one connected to the OTO, for those of you who are aware of these fine distinctions in the Gnostic world, but another organization. He has a pretty much of a Jungian approach, I would say, if you have to characterize his brand of gnosis. And the articles are excellent. I didn't entirely, as usual with Heller, I don't, although I always find his work stimulating, I usually find that I disagree with certain things that he says, and this was no exception. It's nice to have intelligent people that you can disagree with. He, I think, gave a completely rosy picture of Hermeticism in American history. He felt... and I guess this is in a way in keeping with the dualistic way of thinking in Gnosticism, to see things in terms of black and white. So for him, the Hermeticists were entirely the good guys, and the Puritans were entirely the bad guys. Now, if I had to characterize my kind of thinking in contradistinction to Heller's, I would say I use some sort of anarchist dialectics. I say that so you don't think I mean Marxist dialectics. And really, this is very simply put. It means that although there are oppositions, there are dichotomies, there are contrasts, there are conflicts in history. We just started. You haven't missed anything important. That it's more like the yin, famous yin-yang mandala, in which in the black part there's a little light, and in the light part there's a little black. This is not dualism. The yin-yang theory is not dualism, and my thinking is not dualism, because if for no other reason, within the good there's a little bad, and within the bad there's a little good. And so in talking about Hermeticism in American history, I'm not going to give you the Hermeticists always as the flawless, perfect heroes in opposition to the wicked, evil Puritans. It's, in my view, a much more complicated situation than that, much more complex. And, well, so this will gradually unfold. I just wanted to point out that as much as I appreciate Heller's work, and indeed it set me off on this whole chain of thought, and it was a really interesting idea that Roger had to pump me up with this material. If you do go and read it, I've lost my copy already, because in the meantime I moved house and all my papers are in boxes and I can't find anything. But if you can track down the article and read it, you'll see what I mean. I think it's a kind of one-sided view of American history. Before we can get into Hermeticism and hermeneutics in America, I have to give you some background. And I'll slant the background in a way that will presumably be useful in our explorations into American history. How many people here heard my lecture last year on colonial spiritual anarchy? About half. So I apologize if I'm going to repeat a little bit of that material, because these subjects do overlap, and I don't want to leave the other half of the... If everybody had raised their hands, I could have skipped certain things, but perhaps the rest of you won't mind having your memory refreshed a little bit. Anyway, Hermes, as you know, is the messenger god. This is his, in any rate, in my discussion of Hermeticism, will begin by considering him as the messenger. in my book Angels, I discussed this aspect of certain Greek deities to perform the function which in Christianity and Islam and in Judaism we associate with the angels. Angelos means messenger, literally, and even in the iconography you see a very distinct similarity. Hermes is the god who had he had a little helmet with wings on it, and he had wings on his sandals or ankles. It's a little difficult sometimes to tell whether they're growing out of him or out of his shoes, but he is a winged figure, and of course the angels are winged figures. The symbolism of this is dead simple. Like the bird, which can go to the heavens and land on the earth, the messenger figure in mythology and metaphysics is one who mediates, who goes in between the world of the pure absolutes, the gods, call them what you will, and the earth on which we find ourselves, the so-called material plane. So Hermes is par excellence, fills this function, and in fact, as we'll see, this is directly related to Hermes as the representative of esotericism. When we use the word Hermeticism, we're speaking about esotericism in a certain very specific sense. And Hermes is obviously the patron of that sense, of that particular kind of esotericism, which we'll have to examine actually throughout the course of these lectures. It's also important, very important, to note that Hermes is also a trickster and a thief. He is, in fact, the god of thieves. And very many of the things which he does are so similar to the American Indian archetype of the trickster, usually coyote, but also raven and other mythological figures in Native American mythology. The uncanny resemblances, sometimes they're extremely spooky. The tricksterness and the thiefness is also, in a sense, represents the in-betweenness of Hermes. The thief is someone who, is sneaking in between the wall. It's coming in between you and your money, even. And the trickster is one who is an ambiguous figure, who is neither this nor that, who's neither good nor evil. He's a culture hero. He brings the benefits of culture, as Hermes, for example, brings certain musical instruments, and which is also important symbolism, and above all, language. But these gifts, the gifts of the trickster, are themselves already ambiguous. They're neither good nor evil. They're things which are seen to be inevitable within the cultural context, but not necessarily good. Maybe it would have been good, maybe the ultimate good would have been for human beings never to develop any technology or even any language, but to remain a kind of smart simian who is not cursed with the ambiguity of culture. Culture in itself is the most ambiguous of all the gifts of the gods. And in a sense, it's the first gift of the gods, the so-called culture heroes of both Greek, Greco-Roman, and of Native American mythology. Again, very similar figures in this way. What they bring is always a double-edged sword. There's always a trick involved. So this, for example, again, these figures are usually psychopomps. The words, which means literally, let's see, what is it literally? The one who carries the soul. In other words, brings the soul between life and death. It's Hermes who accompanies the soul on its journey between death and whatever comes after death. It's the angel of death in Islamic myth, for example, Israel. The angels they get the functions passed around amongst themselves. It isn't always the same angel. Sometimes it's Gabriel, who blows the last trump. Sometimes it's other angelic or archangelic figures who is the one who leads the soul through the death experience, which again is a very shadowy and ambiguous role. So all these forms of ambiguity can be summed up, I think, in one symbol, and that is that Hermes is language. He's the god of language. He's the god of especially of written language, but also, I would say, of language in general, because language is the ultimate mediation. It's what goes in between. It's going in between you and me right now. It's going through the air. It's being mediated by the air, by vibrations in the air. It's being mediated. My whole mental process has to go on before I can blurt out a word. And your mental processes have your nervous systems, everything mediating what I'm saying. You're giving it your own interpretation. The whole thing is an extremely in-between experience. Language is the most in-between of all experiences, or the first of all the in-between experiences. And therefore it's appropriate that the messenger god is the god of language. Eric Davis, who's one of the frequently speaks here, wrote a beautiful essay on the Santeria voodoo Yoruba deity Elegua, in which he said that Elegua fulfills this exact same mythic role in the Yoruba/American traditions, such as Santeria and voodoo. He could have, I forget if he did or not, he could have pointed out that in this sense, Elegua is perfectly syncretizable with Hermes. There's a story about Hermes and Zeus and the invention of writing. It seems that Hermes goes to his father Zeus and says, "What a great invention I've just come up with. Look, I make these marks on paper or stone or something, and they mean words, and now people can communicate over long distances, and not only that, nothing will be forgotten." And Zeus says, "On the contrary, now everything will be forgotten." And he says, "This is a terrible invention, but now you've done it, there's no turning back, so we might as well make the best of a bad thing." And this is, in my experience, this is absolutely true. As close as I've ever gotten to non-literate cultures, the more perfected the art of memory is. The more writing there is, the less memory there is. Until you get, I think, finally to the very nice symbolism in which we talk about the memory in our computers. We've completely removed this function from ourselves and put it into our computers, so we don't need any memory at all anymore. And indeed, as I like to say, those who know history are condemned to sit around and watch while other idiots repeat it over and over and over again. There is no memory in the public sphere. There is no memory in politics. There is no memory in history as it is mediated for us by newspapers and magazines and television and what is generally called the media. An awful pleonasm, but one which has come to have its own meaning. Media is a plural word, but in fact it is now used as a singular word. The media is. People say the media is this, the media is that. And it's very clear why this plural noun has been changed into a singular noun. The whole thing is like has become entitized. It's taken on some kind of a life. There is a kind of a simulated, spectacular, semi-life, which could also be called, let's say, a half-life, that permeates the media. And so it's no wonder that the media somehow seems to us to act on its own, not under the direction of any one individual, but as if it had a mind or a life or a will of its own, and in fact as if it were some sort of deity, whether positive or negative, or more likely, most likely, always ambiguous. So this is all this mythology is at the root of what we call Hermeticism. Again, Hermes is that which goes, I've written, is that which goes in between and is tricky, and that is exactly the description of language. Language is, by its very nature, ambiguous. All the attempts of especially the Chomskyan deep grammar linguists to find some kind of absolutes in language, some kind of deep grammar on the level even of the DNA or the genetic structure of mind. I think, frankly, I have great respect for Noam Chomsky on many, many levels, but I think that this attempt to look for some kind of Kantian or even Hegelian absolutes in language is totally doomed. Language itself will always be ambiguous. If it were ever not ambiguous, it would simply be some kind of Russellian symbolic logic, and as we know from Kurt Gödel, even that is doomed to ambiguity. Mathematics cannot contain a proof of its own basic axioms. And inasmuch as symbolic logic is a form of mathematics, symbolic logic is still not an unambiguous language, despite what you may hear from various positivist philosophers. So, essentially, how does this tie in with esotericism? The in-between, it's the action of the in-betweenness. In Arabic, there's a word ta'wil, which literally means carrying back. And it means to take a word or a concept and carry it back through a series of operations to its original meaning. Now, we don't have to get involved in what this specifically means in the history of Islamic thought. I find it a very useful universal tool, this concept of ta'wil, which has been translated also as hermeneutics. Hermeneutics, in the narrow sense of the word, is a modern philosophy that sort of spins off from Heidegger and others. And I'm not going to deal with hermeneutics on that level. I'm extremely ignorant about that. I really don't know very much about it. But my take on hermeneutics comes through a thinker called Henry Corbin, whose works some of you may be familiar with, Corbin. And he constantly uses this word ta'wil and hermeneutics or spiritual hermeneutics as a tool in his special philosophy, his special esoteric philosophy, which has been very influential for me. And so that's the way I use the word hermeneutic is not as a philosophy in itself, but as a philosophical tool. And the tool is involved in carrying something, for example, a word, back to its source, not necessarily using etymology, although etymology can be useful. A lot of the spiritual traditions have what can only be called false etymologies, where a word will remind them of another word. There will be somehow, in some kind of acrostic or punning sense, words contained within words that set off chains of thought. The Jewish Kabbalists are great at this kind of play. It's word play, literally. The Sufis have also used it. And modern philosophers are chary of this because the first thing that will happen is that someone will say, this is a false etymology. But that's precisely the point. Etymology itself is not an exact science. And the more ambiguous an etymology is, perhaps the more we can learn from it. So what we're looking for is not linguistic origins of words, but the origins of certain words or concepts in terms of their deep meaning. Not so much a temporal past, going back into some sort of temporal past, in what Saussure would call diachronic thinking, but in synchronic, as if all language happens on the same level plane at the same time, and we can make links completely ignoring the history of language. So, is that clear? I'm not sure I'm expressing this idea very clearly. I guess what I mean to say is that there are two ways of doing linguistics. One is diachronic and one is synchronic. Diachronic has to do with etymologies and searching out the origins of words, whereas synchronic linguistics has to do with relationships between words and languages and relations within language, as if there were no historical becoming, as if it's all one big globe of language, so to speak, that you can position yourself in terms of, let's say, space rather than time. So again, as we look for origins of things, what we're going to be looking for here, in a sense, is the origin of the American idea of liberty. That's the overarching theme of these 4 lectures, is the hermeneutics of liberty. So we're really, it would be interesting to do an etymological take on the word. It's something actually that I haven't done. I will try to do it in the course of one of these lectures, to go to Oliver Onions or one of the great etymological dictionaries and look up the word liberty and see what its farthest back historical roots in presumably Indo-European languages might be. But that is of only secondary interest. It might throw some light on our search, but it might not. I'm more interested in the hermeneutics of the concept than of the word itself as a phoneme, so we need to begin with something like a structural search back through Hermeticism, and because the thesis it was Heller's thesis, and it will be in part my thesis too, that this concept of liberty, which we associate with more or less non-religious and certainly non-mystical aspect of American history, the founding fathers, the Constitution, the Revolution, what have you, that behind all of these symbols as they're presented to us on a plate in high school, and it's usually the last time any of us pay any attention, or college at the very latest, to these questions, behind all these symbols, the symbol of the flag, the symbol of the Constitution, the symbol of the Liberty Tree, this, that, whatever, there are yet further echoing backs of symbol upon symbol upon symbol. And so we have to go pretty far back to begin our search here. And I guess I won't push it too far here. I just want to go back to the 1st century A.D. This reminds me of when I was in Iran and the Iranian Revolution was breaking out, and this reporter from, I think it was the New York Times, came to visit me, and he said, quick, I want the religious background on what's happening. I said, how much time have you got? We have to go back at least the 7th century. He said, oh, well, okay, forget it. So that was my contribution to world understanding of the Iranian Revolution. So we have to go back to the 1st century A.D., when a series of texts were created called the Corpus Hermeticum. How many of you are familiar with that at all? A few. Okay, well, it's been completely translated. It has been excerpted. The good bits have been published in various editions. I'm not exactly sure what's in print and what isn't, but a trip to the library would at least allow you a quick browse for the Corpus Hermeticum, which is probably one of the most influential books in the whole of Western history, and one of the most secretly influential books. That is to say, it's not one that you get in your first-year college course of contemporary civilization, like what I had to suffer through at Columbia, in which you read all the great books, Well, it isn't always the great books that explain what's going on. Sometimes it's extremely obscure books that you need to read to know what's really going on, because the great books are what they want you to think is going on. What the, Columbia University wants you to think is reality. My God, it's how useless, what a useless concept. So check out the Corpus Hermeticum. It's a secret river that flows beneath masses and masses of Western, and even, as a matter of fact, Eastern history as well, because it was translated into Arabic, and its influence filtered into the Islamic world in very distinct and interesting ways, and from Islam into the even yet farther east. But again, I'm not so much concerned with that here in these lectures as I am with the Western influence. All right, it was written in Greek, probably in Alexandria, where a lot of Gnostic and syncretistic religious thinking was going on. And out of that same cauldron of Alexandrian speculation, we have Gnosticism, which has only recently been rediscovered in its authentic sources through the digging up of the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt in 1945. So these, the real Gnostic texts were almost unknown until the 20th century. The Corpus Hermeticum, by contrast, was rediscovered. If it had never really been lost, actually, but it was rediscovered when a man named Plethon, Plethon, Gemistoplethon, came from Byzantium to Italy early on in the Renaissance. I can't give you the dates. Bringing a whole lot of Platonic and Hermetic source books with him, manuscripts, which made him an extremely popular chap in Italy because suddenly he just happened to arrive at the right time when the whole, let's say, monolithic edifice of medieval Christianity was beginning to crumble away, and there were people, especially in Italy, who were looking for new ideas, but new was a dirty word, you know. New is something that's only very recently become a good word. In the early Renaissance or the late Middle Ages, the period we're talking about, the whole idea of new was like bad. If something is new, it couldn't be good, because if something is true, obviously it must have been known at the very beginnings of human development. It's a very logical way of thinking, really. And so when the Italian Renaissance, as we now come to think of it, looking back on it really with a very retrospective view, as something new and exciting, what they were looking for was not something new and exciting at all. What they were looking for was something that had an origin even back and beyond Christianity. They were dissatisfied in some subtle and dangerous way with Christianity, and they were Italians. They had all surrounding them the broken remains of another culture, paganism, and they were fascinated by it. They realized that it was older than Christianity, and they wanted to know what all those broken fragments meant. And one discovery that had been made quite recently, I'm not exactly sure of the details of how, but Egyptian hieroglyphics had begun to be seen for the first time in the West in a long, long time. And a lot of the Italian humanists and thinkers, scientists, whatever, all these modern terms are a bit inadequate in various ways. They were fascinated by the whole idea of Egyptian hieroglyphics because I think I'm going to have to explain a lot more before I can explain why this fascination with Egyptian hieroglyphics, but I'll get to it. The point is that the Corpus Hermeticum was available in Greek, and Greek could be read. It was translated into Latin very, very quickly, long before many of the Aristotelian and Platonic works that we now consider much, much more important. And it was presented to the Italian smart guys as something that was very ancient indeed. It was, in fact, supposedly written by Hermes Trismegistus, who I suppose you could say was considered to be a human avatar of the god Hermes, who had probably lived, in most people's estimation, as much as 10 centuries before Christ. Something like that. I mean, it's all myth anyway. It doesn't much matter. The point is, they thought this was something exceedingly ancient. Prisca Theologia, they called it the original theology. This is how it appeared to them. So there was great excitement over the discovery or rediscovery of the corpus hermeticum in Western philosophy, Western science, which was all the same thing at that time. And the texts were gone over with a fine-tooth comb. It was presumed, by the way, that someone at some point had translated them from hieroglyphics into Greek. This is certainly not true. The texts never existed as hieroglyphics, but it was believed that they had been. And of course, what people believe is infinitely more important than what's really the case. So this book, the Corpus Hermeticum, which is really quite large and contains a fairly daunting mishmash of stuff, was seen as a single work by a single author representing a single homogeneous tradition, Hermeticism. And it gave rise to what really could only be called a mass conversion. People had to be extremely careful about the church, you know. You couldn't just say, oh, I'm sick of Christianity, I think I'll be a pagan. You know, this is what happened to Giordano Bruno, in essence, the one Hermeticist who was really and truly martyred for his beliefs, burned at the stake in Rome. There's a statue there, I've seen it myself, on the very spot where he was fried, for paganism, essentially. So you had to be really extremely careful. Oh, and by the way, before I forget, I should say Frances Yates has written a book on Giordano Bruno. This is an English woman who died, I don't know, sometime in the 70s, I think. Her books she single-handedly caused yet another revival of Hermeticism in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Totally brilliant woman. Wonderful books. Absolutely 5-star recommendation to read anything you can get your hands on by Frances Yates, especially Giordano Bruno, The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, and The Art of Memory. The Art of Memory. You know, I was talking about memory as a Hermetic concept. Again, in the Renaissance and up through the 17th century, in which Hermeticism was a leading contender for the scientific paradigm in the Western world, the art of memory was considered to be a Hermetic art, a magical art. And this knowledge was totally lost until Yeats rediscovered it in exceedingly obscure and never before republished Renaissance texts. The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, yeah. And everything which anyone has done since in the field of Hermeticism has been thanks to Frances Yates. I would mention also of great interest is the work of Ioan Culiano, Couliano, and the first name is Ioan. It's a Romanian name. Culiano was Mircea Eliade's right-hand man, and was sort of inherited Eliade's mantle at the University of Chicago when he died in, 1980, somewhere around in there. And Culiano, I have to tell you this, Culiano was making very pointed remarks about the so-called Romanian Revolution, you know, in '89, and saying that this was not a democratic revolution at all, that these were KGB scum who had come back into power under a different name, and recrudescent fascists. And one day, Professor Culiano was found dead with a bullet hole through his head in the men's room in the Chicago Department of Religion. And my friend Andrei Codrescu, subsequently, who had been saying exactly the same thing and had gone to Romania and done an NPR special revealing this very same stuff, was getting death threats. And for about a year, he was totally in fear that the Romanian pigs were going to get him as well. And they definitely got Culiano. So here was a man who's I mean, in a way, it kind of validates his work. You know, I mean, I'm really sorry he was only in his 40s or 50s when he bought it, but you know, it shows that he was taken seriously. You know, the way Stalin sort of validated Russian poetry. You know what I mean? So Culiano has a book called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, which is very brilliant and is in print now. A lot of his stuff is coming into paperback now. He also has a book on Gnosticism, which I'm looking forward to reading. I haven't gotten that yet. In Eros and Magic in the Renaissance is very much a book that lies behind a lot of what I'm going to be saying. And in the last lecture that I'm going to give on what I call radical neo-Hermeticism, Culiano is very much the dedicatee of that work. So his thinking will keep on cropping up in the course of these lectures. So, let's see what else I had to say here by way of introduction. So let me just sum up. I'll read this little paragraph. Thus, hermeneutics, or phenomenological exegesis. What do I mean by phenomenological exegesis? Is simply, once again, phenomenology is a modern school of philosophy, but I'm not really paying any attention to it. I simply mean looking at the phenomena as the phenomena instead of bringing all kinds of alien criteria to bear. In other words, when I study Hermetic communities in 17th century America, which is the source of this paper, I would very much like it if these phenomena could speak for themselves, first of all, and only later, if at all, would I bring to bear critical theory of some sort. I mean, the Marxists are terrible anti-phenomenologists in this way because they always want to bring in dialectical materialism right away. I mean, boom, you know, talk about philosophizing with a hammer. This is bad phenomenology. Good phenomenology is what, like, modern anthropologists do when they let the natives speak for themselves, for Christ's sake, for once, you know, instead of coming and saying, oh, yes, right, we understand, these are primitive people, it's totemism, it's taboo, you know, it's this and it's that. Well, why don't you listen to what they have to say first, and then maybe you could bring in some interesting criteria from other critical theory. So when I say phenomenological exegesis, that's what I mean. First and foremost, we want to analyze these phenomena by letting the phenomena analyze themselves as much as possible. So this is not a philosophy of logic. As I say, symbolic logic is not an adequate tool here. That would perhaps fall under the sign of Apollo. Nor is it a philosophy of rapture per se, which would fall under the sign of Dionysus. Nor is it a philosophy of aesthetics and emotions, which would fall under the sign of Aphrodite. But it is precisely always the ambiguous third term between any two gods. That's Hermes, the messenger of the gods, the one who goes in between Apollo and Dionysus, between Dionysus and Aphrodite, between Aphrodite and Apollo, conveying the messages and always somehow screwing it up on some level, making it ambiguous. And the ambiguity is not a bad thing. As Michel Serres, who's another person whose work you might be interested in, has written a book called Hermes, which I've just finally read. It's been on my list for years. Very, very brilliant, extremely difficult to read, not easy going. But he has a theory of information as involving, of necessity, a third term or a third person, which he calls the parasite, or Hermes. And I think really what he's saying, although it has infinite ramifications in philosophy and history of science especially, very, very interesting ramifications, is really dead simple. It's just that the Hermetic function is that, again, as I said, it's that in-betweenness, and that trickiness that is the function of the in-betweenness, the tendency to screw up the message on some level. Information theory, if you're familiar with information theory, you know that information is always in opposition to noise. But the interesting thing is that without noise, there would be no information. The two are necessary complements in information theory. I can't begin to explain this to you. I'm not even sure that I understand it really. But the fact remains that in information theory, noise is an essential ingredient. If you eliminated noise completely from communication, somehow or another, information would cease to be transmitted. So the third term, the ambiguous third term, the parasite, Hermes the trickster, call him or it what you will, is a completely necessary term to communication, even at the same time as it is screwing it up on the level of what we consider rigid and rational discourse of A equals A. So, information, right, but always ambiguous information. True in the sense of brilliant or apt, as we speak of someone's true aim as an archer. Not necessarily true in any rigorous mathematical sense of the word truth, as, let's say, a Bertrand Russell attempted to discover it. Now, here we come to an extremely important concept, and that is the image. We've spoken about language and about words. What is imagery? What is the image? The image itself is also a kind of communication. If I draw a picture here, I don't have to say the word, I hope, anyway. It's a flower, right? And the image itself has communicated something. If I say the word flower, I've already reduced it, because to some of you, I don't know, it might look like something else, which would be an interesting dimensions to the communication that just happened. In fact, it would have, unlike the word flower, the image itself might call forth whole rafts of symbolic material from your reading, from your life experience. You might hallucinate the smell. All kinds of things might happen because I'd communicated with an image instead of with a word. So this is now getting back to the idea of hieroglyphics. The Egyptian hieroglyphics were so fascinating to the Hermeticists, the Renaissance Hermeticists, because it was written language, but it was also imagery. This was quite clear. No one could read it, by the way. This is very important, and very important. It was not until Napoleon's, Bertillon, or whatever his name was, discovered the Rosetta Stone during Napoleon's conquest of Egypt in 1801 or whatever it was, that anybody could read Egyptian hieroglyphics at all. But there were infinite numbers of people throughout the Renaissance and 17th and 18th century who thought they could read them. They thought that they had received direct communications, perhaps from Hermes himself, to allow them to unfold what these hieroglyphics meant. So there's a whole lost history, which I would dearly love to have the time and expertise to delve into. It's a work that Francis Yates left undone, which someone really severely needs to do, which is to examine all that literature of people who thought they could read hieroglyphics but who couldn't. Because now we laugh at them, right? You're laughing now, and it is funny. But since 1800, since we know, supposedly, we know how to read Egyptian hieroglyphics, so all this literature has been flushed. No one studies it. No one does scholarly editions of the books. No one brings it back into print. No one cares. And yet, from the 16th to the 18th century, this was hot intellectual stuff. This was the thin edge of the wedge. This was paradigm creation that was going on. And because Hermeticism, as we'll hear in the course of this story, Hermeticism lost the paradigm war to the Cartesians, to the mechanical philosophers, the Newtonians, the experimentalists, all that great and wonderful war for the paradigm that went on through the 17th century. Hermeticism was a contender, Hermeticism at various times looked like it was going to win, but it didn't. It lost really badly. And now it is completely the only people who pay any attention to it all are a few historians of chemistry who will tell you that such and such an alchemist by accident discovered some kind of acid or something. He was, of course, completely deluded and looking to transmute lead into gold, but by accident he discovered something interesting that adds to the history of chemistry. That's it. These are the... Okay? So images are perhaps, in some ways, less ambiguous than words. In other ways, perhaps they're more ambiguous. But the lack of ambiguity in the image, a beautiful example of it is the Catholic Church and its total horror at the translation of the Bible into the vernacular. You may not know this, but throughout the entire Middle Ages, the Catholic Church did its best to see that nobody read the Bible. It was to only be mediated for you by your priest who could read Latin. He would tell you what you needed to know about what was in the Bible. You were not supposed to read it. And when Wycliffe translated the Bible into English, one of the Lollards in the early 16th, I think, or maybe late 15th century, and then subsequently other Protestant radicals produced bit by bit vernacular Bibles leading up to Luther and Calvin, who were at the end of this process, not the beginning at all. All through this, the Catholic Church fought tooth and nail to have these books banned and burned. And there's some lovely works that were published as late as the 16th century. I've just been reading about them by Catholic theologians saying flat out that it's not good for people to know what's in the Bible. They don't need to know what's in the Bible. It's just going to cause trouble. They're going to think they know it all. They're going to leave the church. They're going to cause rebellion and uproar. And it all came. They were right. That's exactly what happened. That's the origin of Protestantism is a printed book, the vernacular Bible. That's what did it. So what they said was what's good for the people is images in the church. The Catholic theologians said, the stone images, the images of the saints and of the Virgin, of the crucifix, and so forth and so on. This is the right kind of communication for the people. Why? Because in fact it's less ambiguous than the written word in their mind, and I think you can see their point. It's a very good point. Images communicate on a level which at the same time goes beneath and above language, spoken language or written language. So even though that process of going above and over, under and over at the same time has its own kind of ambiguity, still in comparison with the written word or the spoken word on a certain level, this is more direct. It goes more directly to the soul. As I said, by the drawing of the flower, maybe some of you would even hallucinate the smell of a flower, whereas it's very unlikely that would happen if I just said the word, unless it was in a really good poem, maybe. So the occultists, the Hermeticists, the people who wanted to carry out operations on reality, and this is very important. This is what Hermeticism is about. It's an occult science which wants to carry out operations on reality which will change reality. And clearly, one of the very, very efficient ways of doing that is not by talking about it. As Marx said, the point of philosophy is not just to talk about reality, but to change it. Well, that is way before the fact what the Hermeticists wanted to do. So imagery had a great appeal to them. Hence, the fascination with hieroglyphics. And going back to the Corpus Hermeticum, one of the most interesting of all the tracts in the Corpus Hermeticum is the one about images, by which was meant statues, in which it was said that you could actually divinize a statue. First of all, by carving it, by creating it according to the known attributes of the deity in question. For example, if it was Hermes, we would have wings on the head and feet. It would be perhaps in the latest Hellenistic representations was of a naked youth, maybe 25 years old, something like that, Olympic runner-looking character, right, that one, which really survives. That image survives right up into our own times because that Hermes pencils, Hermes automobiles, these images are still around. They're still absolutely floating around in the collective conscious or unconscious. They're being used by advertisers to this very day. Venus pencils, that's the one I was thinking of. What was Hermes was most... Hermes rocket, yeah, typewriter. Yeah, flower delivery, great. Good, all good stuff, you know. I mean, this is very real. So, what you had to do, first of all, right, so you had to get the imagery right, then you had to know what planet was involved, in this case Mercury. You had to know what color was right, I think blue. You had to know what incense was right. I don't know in this case, but with Venus, for example, it would be roses. You had to know what metal was right, mercury, as we still call it. For the sun, it's gold. For the moon, it's silver. Planetary metals, which are still discussed in hortatory astrology. You can read it in the Daily News. You know, this symbolism still lives on. So this is where it comes from. It comes from this one essay in the Corpus Hermeticum. This essay, more than any of the others, even the Poimandres, the first and longest and most philosophically interesting of the corpus, this one little essay is probably maybe the most influential piece of writing in the whole of Western history. I don't know. It certainly had an immense influence on the Renaissance. Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno, Marsilio Ficino, John Dee, Robert Flood, all the famous Renaissance Hermeticists. I'll mention a few things about some of these people more. They were all involved in this kind of image magic. And I guess probably Pico della Mirandola was the purest of these magicians, although, I mean, even Paracelsus, who came in the late 16th century, was still involved in precisely this kind of magic. Let's say you want to improve your ability as a hermeneuticist. So you need the power of Hermes. You need that special, ambiguous, and yet penetrating intelligence of the Hermetic divinity, of the divine quality of Hermes. So you do this, you would actually carry out, according to the Corpus Hermeticum and other later more evolved works, a ceremony in which you would make a statue of that god, and a lot of the Renaissance art that we see now was not meant for pure decor at all. It was meant for magic, and there was a whole school. I've visited a lot of their villas, their private houses, in and around Rome, especially in the 14th, 14th and 15th century in particular. There's a whole school of people, which included even cardinals of the church, as well as humanists and non-religious figures, artists, architects, poets, scientists, who were in fact just doing all those other things as well. There was no such thing as a scientist as we understand it now, someone who just only does hard science. Natural philosophy, it was called. Science was called natural philosophy, in other words, thinking about nature. And that will be an extremely important concept for us in these lectures. So I've been to their houses. I've seen the house of one of the great cardinals of the church, in which there is not one Christian image in the whole house. And Queen Christina of Sweden, when she visited this house in the when did she live? I don't know. Famous Queen of Sweden, who's a patron of the humanists and so forth and so on. She's sitting in the garden, Capriola it's called. She said, "It's as if the Savior had never been born." And that's what this particular little Hermetic school in Italy were into. They wanted to go back before the time that the Savior was born, and recover that Prisca Theologia, that original theology, the deepest, oldest, most profound theology. Why? Because it worked. It had practical applications. This was really fascinating to people who had suffered under centuries of Catholic theology, which was not about working on the natural world at all. It was about escaping from the natural world, leaving the body behind in as many ways as possible, either through asceticism or, in extreme cases, even among the Gnostics, even forms of ritual suicide. So the great thing was suddenly the rediscovery of the material world, of the body, and of a philosophy that would work in the material world, that would work on the body. So you make your statue, you burn your incense, you evoke the right planetary spirit, and you have an intention. You keep all this imagery and memory according to the art of memory that Francis Yates analyzed so brilliantly, and this will change your consciousness in a magical, direct way, so that you will become more hermetic, or more Aphrodisian, or more Jovian, as the case might be, more solar, whatever it is you're looking for, whatever kind of qualities, personal qualities you're looking for, or whatever kind of a goal you have. For example, you're involved, you're off to war. Probably you would want to invoke Mars, iron, black. I think hellebore was the incense of choice. Various kinds of dark, stinky incenses, and get that martial spirit. Oh, sorry, red, not black, but red was the color of Mars. So this, for all these reasons, the Corpus Hermeticum was an immensely influential book. It lies really at the origins of what we now think of as science. As I say, work on the world and in the world, on material reality, the analysis of what material reality might be. Now, at some point, I was trying to find the date today in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it let me down. So I can't. I haven't got the date in my mind, but I'll get it for you. I think it was in the early 1600s, the early 17th century. A brilliant humanist scholar proved that the Corpus Hermeticum was not like from the 10 centuries or more before Christ, but that it was from 1 century after Christ. He proved it through analyse de texte, through textual analysis of the actual words that were used, comparing them with other manuscripts, with other works, showing that this language in these texts could not have been any earlier than 1st century AD. And that judgment still stands. I believe the guy's name was Scaliger, but I'm not sure. I may be mixing him up with somebody else. I'll check that out too. So don't make notes on that. Stop that. So this was the beginning of the end for the Hermetic paradigm. It was then that the Newtons and the Descartes could say, you've been spending all this time and energy on a book that you thought was the Prisca Theologia, and in fact it's just a late Hellenistic work. So, of course, this didn't really disturb the Hermeticists all that much. Some of them gave up. Others said, well, so what? It's still the truth. But it's a kind of weak argument compared to Cartesian rationalism, and in fact, it was the beginning of, as I said, it was the beginning of the end for Hermeticism. But for many other reasons, Hermeticism lost the big paradigm battle. But as Culiano points out, it's not because Cartesian science worked better, or that Newtonian science worked better than Hermetic science. At the time, this was certainly not true. It's dubious that it's true even now, but it was certainly not true then. Newton and Descartes had absolutely nothing to show. They didn't build any atom bombs. They didn't build any steam engines. They had nothing to show. It was all pure mentation. So the Hermetic paradigm had just as much of a chance to win as the other paradigms that were struggling for hegemony in the world of 17th century science. One of the reasons why it lost out was the scorn that was poured on it because of this textual analysis that happened. Let's see, where am I here? All right, I think that's. I just wanted to give this as a general introduction to Hermeticism. We're going to have to. We will go back and dip into the sources from time to time, but Oh, and let me just mention one or two other things here. The great artist Piranesi, you familiar with his work? He's famous for the series called I Carceri, the prisons. If you can find a book of his work, he was a Hermeticist, and I've always thought he gave one of the most beautiful artistic expressions to Hermeticism. And his work is full of sort of pseudo-Egyptian hieroglyphics and stuff like that. He was very much involved in all this thought. It came quite late in its development and kind of inherited the whole thing. This is very parenthetical. If you want to see images which are beautiful and expressive of what I've been talking about, Piranesi is one of your main men. There are also many, of course, books of emblem books were very, very popular with the Hermeticists, obviously, since they wanted to communicate through images rather than words, or as well as words. In fact, the most famous of them, the Atalanta Fugiens of Count Michael Mayer, has recently been republished by Phanes Press, Phanes. It might even be in the bookstore here, I don't know. It's a series of of engravings, 50 engravings, each one with a very ambiguous little poem, and 50 pieces of music that Mayer also composed to go along with the images. And presumably also when he used the book himself with his pals, they would also have the right incense and the right colors and the right costumes and the right statues and so forth. So the Atalanta Fugiens, and you get the tape. Someone has finally played all the music and it's on the tape, and you can buy the tape with the book. And it's a wonderful way to experience late Renaissance Hermeticism by one of the nicest of all the artists who worked in this field. Very, very good artist was Mayer, M-A-I-E-R. And I guess I should say one more thing before we get to America about Culiano's theories. I'll go into this in much greater detail in the fourth lecture, but he pointed out that one of the great unexplored aspects of Hermeticism was its relationship to the development of what we could call mass psychology. Now, it's very, very clear when you come to think of it, especially in the 20th century, but starting, going back as far as you want, really, images are one of the prime tools for moving groups of people's mind, the group mind in some way. We all know how difficult it is to persuade, let's say, the American public through rational language that there's something deeply wrong with American politics. This is a constant frustration of the leftist, of the radical, and of the liberal, who are all extremely word-oriented people, by and large. And the rational people come along, they come here, they speak here, people who have thought, who speak, who have the logos down cold, and nothing happens, nothing changes, no influence is made on the mass mind. But one picture on television lasting a split second can change the world, and we know how this is done. We've seen it happen over and over again. One image of bombs over Baghdad, and Bluey, that's it. Everyone just changes their mind, One day, 70% of the American population did not want war with Iraq. An image appears on CNN, and suddenly we're told that 99% of the American public is for the war. How does this happen? It's the magic of images. It is Hermeticism, but it's Hermeticism gone bad. It's Hermeticism used for what you and I presume, would consider evil. And this is something that I want us to keep in mind as we move through all these stories of Hermeticism in history, that there is this good side and the bad side. And that Culiano says if there is a modern group of people who have inherited Hermeticism, it's advertisers and demagogues. And what he's suggesting is that we, the people who are not interested in demagoguery and fascism, had better learn this and learn how to make Hermeticism work for us. Okay? So I just want to leave this thought percolating in your mind, and I'm going to come back to it in the fourth lecture. All right, so we still can't quite get to America yet because we have to go through England, where one of the great, and some of you will be familiar with this material from my last year's talk on colonial America, one of the great Hermetic figures in English history, John Dee, D-E-E, who was not only a great Hermeticist and a great magician, an alchemist, a seer, a visionary, an astrologer. He had it all. He was a polymath in these fields. He was also court astrologer to Queen Elizabeth I, and for some time at least in very good odor at court. Later on, as Dee got more and more involved with what history, especially literary history, calls the School of Night, Sidney, Spencer, and those people, and also Sir Walter Raleigh, and also very dubious characters like Christopher Marlowe, all tie in with this so-called School of Night. We don't really know what it was. You know, it was some kind of maybe it was just a coffee klatch, or maybe it was some kind of cabal. But whatever it was, it began to disturb began to disturb some of the politicians. And Dee ended up very much out of favor, and his house at Mortlake was burned down by a real Hollywood crowd of torch-wielding peasants who were probably set up to do that by one of Dee's political enemies. Anyway, at a certain point, Dee was very much in favor at court. Oh, Shakespeare was one of his friends too, and the figure of in The Tempest, of the magician in The Tempest, is almost certainly based on Dee, according to Francis Yates, who wrote a book on the subject. At one point, Dee drew up, there was a lot of worrying going on about the Spaniards, who had been very busy in the New World already for a century, 1492, and we're already in the 1580s here, and England had done nothing in the New World. And by the way, parenthetically, I meant to say something about that title, Hermes in the New World. This summer, an Indian woman I heard completely blow up about the phrase New World. New to who? She said. All right, fair enough. What was her idea was to say, you should say the Western Hemisphere. So I got up and said, wait a minute, West in relation to what? I mean, you go west from, guess where? Europe. You know, it's like the Near East. Near to what? You know, the Far East. I'm sure Chinese love to be told they live in the Far East, right? Yeah. Well, I guess I'm not home, you know, because I'm in the Far East. All these terms are bullshit. You know, there's none of them that we can use without some kind of unfortunate cultural baggage. So let's just take it that the world was new to these Europeans who were showing up in it, and that's very significant for us because we're descended from them for the most part. Any Native Americans here tonight?
So just in respect to the whole planet in that, Mr. Fuller used to say we should eliminate the words up and down.
Absolutely.
The only thing that's relevant is in and out. We live on the surface of the planet.
Exactly. So all these geographical terms are inadequate. They're all freighted with all kinds of political stuff. You know, none of them. But you know, new in the sense that it was new to John Dee. It was new to Hakluyt, the great map maker. It was new to James Harriot, the mathematician. These are all people associated with the School of Night. It was new to Shakespeare, you know, who wrote The Tempest, to express how new it all felt. So it was new to these guys. And what it was, more than anything else, was the discovery of, again, what was very new to them was also very old, because there were these wild men there, these Caliban figures, who were in the New World, who, at least from the Hermetic point of view, could be expected to be in touch with some kind of Prisca Theologia, some kind of ancient wisdom. Here were people who had never been corrupted by Christianity. You know, we don't say that openly, but that was the fascination. So Dee was, and his pals, his circle, his clique, were extremely interested to get England involved into the New World because, for him, it was going to be the Hermetic utopia. He foresaw the New World because the American Indians, in his estimation, and in the general Hermetic take on the thing, was that the American Indians would be absolutely in tune with their Hermetic ideals, unlike the Christian missionaries. And it was extremely important for us Hermeticists to get there firstest with the mostest. And, so on the other hand, I'm not trying to make him out to be some kind of modern-day liberal. He wasn't at all. He was interested in conquest. He wanted England to have an empire. He wanted to glorify the great Queen Elizabeth, whom he really worshipped, as did many of the most intelligent intellectuals of the period. They were all imperialists in our modern terminology. So what he was really interested in was occult empire. And he cooked up, he may have actually thought this was true, or he might have dreamed it up entirely out of whole cloth, but he actually cooked up a document saying that England had rights in America by right of prior discovery by King Arthur. And Dee was Welsh, and he was a great admirer of King Arthur. So Walter Raleigh, who was another member of this clique, sent out his colonists to Roanoke with all of this that I've been talking about very much on the surface of his mind. I mean, right up there on the surface of his mind. Again, why? So you say, well, why isn't there more written about this? Because it was very bloody dangerous. Because it was a very unchristian way of thinking. And you couldn't just talk about these things openly. Kit Marlowe was assassinated because he talked about these things open. Christopher Marlowe, the playwright, didn't die in a random drunken tavern brawl. He was assassinated. And this is not my opinion as a conspiracy nut. This is actual, recent findings by scholars of English literature. There was a conspiracy going on. It had to do with Francis Walsingham, who was the first spy master of the British Empire. The original for James Bond's M was Francis Walsingham. And Marlowe worked for Walsingham at one time, and apparently the going thesis is that his mouth was too big, he drank too much and talked too much, and he had to be gotten rid of. So it was extremely dangerous. You didn't mess around with these things. But this was very clearly the reason for the settlement at Roanoke. And so I just want to make that clear that no matter how you look at it, the English incursion, the Northern European incursion into the New World was not simply for gold and glory. It had an intellectual meaning. It had a philosophical meaning, and it had specifically a Hermetic meaning, right from the start. And this is, this is repeated on the level of legend in many, many different ways. For example, the Freemasons, although official Freemasonry wasn't started until 1717, it clearly had a pre-existence. And according to the Freemasons, Dee was a Freemason, Raleigh was a Freemason. And the colony in Roanoke was meant to be, in their way of putting it, a Masonic utopia. Well, this is using the term a little bit before it's historically relevant. It would be much more correct to say that it was meant to be a Hermetic utopia, or a Hermeticist utopia. As we know, it didn't work out. The intellectuals couldn't take it. Harriet was the only one who went. He did those wonderful drawings, which you've probably all seen, of like people with faces on their chest and weird stuff like that. And also accurate. Also happens also have done the first accurate drawings of North American Indians. But he left immediately. First chance he got, he couldn't take it, and he was the boldest of them all as far as actually going there. The others preferred to stay back in London and smoke tobacco, which was very much the mark of a member of the School of Night. Raleigh was the big pusher of tobacco. Tobacco was the sort of reefer of the day. And very much seen that way by Christians. There were attempts to prosecute people for smoking tobacco, which is considered to be antisocial, dangerous, unchristian thing to do. Well, where did they learn? They learned it from pagans. That's right. That's right. That's right. So anyway, I want to skip all that because it's really the subject of the lecture that I gave last year, and I don't want to get into repeating myself at any great length. I would now like to fast forward a little bit to the 1690s, so we're skipping almost a century here, but I did cover a lot of that material in my lecture last year, and I would like to tell you about the first communal, the first two, what are considered by historians to be the first two intentional communities in America. Now, clearly, all these colonies were intentional communities in one way or another, especially in New England. It's just because they lasted, historians have lost track of the fact that they were begun as intentional, that Plymouth and Boston were actually founded as utopias. They were meant to be utopias. They, of course, were taken over by what I would call the right wing of Puritanism, to use a modern term which may not really be applicable, so you have to excuse the anachronism. But I'd like to talk about a right wing and a left wing of Puritanism, again, especially in opposition to Heller's thesis that all the bad guys were Puritans and all the good guys were Hermeticists. It was by no means that simple. There was a right wing and a left wing in Protestantism. And what I call the right wing essentially won in Massachusetts and Connecticut. They won politically, and because although at one time they had been considered very radical and dangerous in England, in America, where they achieved power, they became the establishment. They got to be. There were certain aspects of their thinking which led them directly into the most horrible kind of reaction. For example, vis-a-vis the Native Americans, the right-wing Puritans were convinced that these were the devil's people. I mean, there was no question about it. They were the savages were devils. They were devil worshippers, and they weren't even human, which gave the Puritans the right, of course, to slaughter them and eliminate them. A very convenient ideology. And nature, what was nature was not the alchemical primal matter ready to be shaped by the Hermetic imagination. No, nature was a howling wilderness. This is a term which was actually used by some of the very earliest Puritan writers. So we know about the right wing of Puritanism. They won. We're them, in effect. Our history was shaped, our conscious history was shaped largely by these people. What we don't know so much about, although thanks to historians like Christopher Hill and Norman Cohn, we're beginning to find out in the latter part of the 20th century a little bit about it, was the left wing of Puritanism, the really radical. In fact, Puritan is no longer even the right word. Protestant isn't even probably the right word. As I said in my paper last year, antinomian or anarchist is probably a more accurate term, even though anarchist would be another historical anachronism. And on these lines, well, we had the radical sects, which I talked about last year, but now I want to point out that Hermeticism was very much part of the left in this sense. Because it was anti-Christian, really anti-Christian, not just non-Christian, but anti-Christian, therefore anti-establishment, therefore it found itself very much on the revolutionary side of the fence in the 16th and 17th century. And this is another reason why Hermeticism lost the paradigm battle, because it associated itself with revolutionary forces which, after the English Revolution was overthrown and monarchy restored, these forces were with the political losers, and Hermeticism had been one of the prime ideologies of the extreme revolutionaries during the English Revolution. And when these people were first betrayed by Cromwell and then later completely eliminated by the Restoration, Hermeticism went with them, went underground, became an underground ideology. So where do you think a lot of these people would escape to? Where would be the logical place for you to go in, let's say, 1660 or 1670, if you were a Hermeticist, a leftist, in the sense that a very loose sense that I'm using that word, a mystic, a revolutionary, and English? Where do you think you would possibly go? Yes, America, right, of course. So how come American historians don't know this? How come American historians haven't written about this? I don't know, you tell me. There are a few specialists working in this field. Otherwise I would have no sources for most of what I know at all. But as far as the general take on American history, and we've been getting an awful lot of so-called revisionist history in this year of Columbus, but still, this is, in my hearing, this is not being discussed. This is still big news. There were, let's forget the lower class rebels, the ranters and diggers and those kind of people. That's the subject for another paper altogether. Let's talk about the very well-educated intellectual Hermeticists. What about them? Well, in the very early period, there aren't too many specific things we can point to, but there are a few. The English alchemist Philolethes, Philolethes, whose true identity is argued about. No one's quite sure who he really was, but he was the writer of a number of texts on alchemy, and it is known that he spent a number of years in New England. He subsequently returned to England, I think probably because he couldn't get along with the Puritans. However, interestingly enough, the son of the famous Governor Winthrop, who had been governor of both Massachusetts and Connecticut, and his son did some time as governor of Connecticut. I forget his first name. Winthrop, anyway. Very, very active alchemist and Hermeticist. And he stayed in America. He was, in fact, I think he might have even been born in America. But he was very early example of an alchemist in America. This is all we're talking, this would all still be prior to the 1690s. In 1694, we have something really interesting that we can point to, and that is, as I say, these first two, what a few historians have written about as the first two intentional communities in America. Interestingly enough, these communities are not discussed by most historians of utopianism in America. Most of the historians have missed these out completely. I have only found out about them through this book, Communalism, by Kenneth Rexroth, the great San Francisco Renaissance poet. This is a very, very hard book to get. It was loaned to me by a friend who, I don't know where he found it. It really deserves to be reprinted. It's a little outdated in some of its research, and it's a book by a poet, so there are no footnotes. I think he probably got most of his information from this book, Backwoods Utopias by Arthur Bester, who meant to write a whole series of books on the utopian movement in America, but died before he could do so. This is the only book he got out. This is also pretty hard to find. I was lucky to find this reprint edition from University of Pennsylvania, 1970. Here you, in this book, you will find some footnotes, and there was an article published in a Journal of Pennsylvania History on one of these groups, which was actually the first time I ever heard of them. A friend sent it to me in the mail. It's packed up with my papers, and I wasn't able to put my hands on it. But the only thing, as far as I can remember, the only thing that article had, which Rexroth doesn't have, was some archaeological stuff. And I'll mention that when I thought the easiest thing to do would be to read you about these first two colonies. The first one was established by the followers of Jean de Labadie, Labadie, more or less independent of Penn's settlement of Pennsylvania, but under his influence in exactly the same time. This was Bohemia Manor. I don't know whether he says it. Bohemia Manor was in Maryland on the Chesapeake. Labadie was born in 1610 at Bourg near Bordeaux, and originally at first ordained a Jesuit priest, but his pastorate was in Switzerland, the Low Countries, London, where for a while his influence on the separatist churches was quite extensive, and he's usually mentioned now as a Protestant theologian. His doctrines included community of goods, mystical marriage, millenarianism, celebration of the seventh-day Sabbath, and the setting aside of a celibate elite. Descartes was familiar with his ideas, and if there is anything to the mysterious signature René Descartes R cross C, which exists in some of Cartesian manuscripts, Labadie may have incorporated some of the ideas of the Rosicrucian Brotherhood, assuming, which has been disputed, that such a group then existed. If you read Francis Yates's Rosicrucian Enlightenment, you'll get the whole story on this. There may not have ever been a real Rosicrucian group. It may have been a hoax perpetrated by some extreme left-wing Protestants to cause pain and confusion to the Catholic Church. And it certainly succeeded in doing that. However, it also was taken extremely seriously by the remnants of the Hermetic movement, who all wrote letters to each other trying to find out where these Rosicrucians had their headquarters so that they could all join. And most of them were some historians would say they were all disappointed because there were no Rosicrucians. Other historians are willing to admit that there might have been something going on. I think Yates has the most balanced view, which is, some of this, some of that, as usual. Anyway, the Rosicrucians, for our purpose, all we have to understand is that the Rosicrucian Brotherhood presented itself as the inheritors of the Hermetic mantle. They were going to be the Hermeticists of Europe. Persecuted by the authorities, Protestant, Roman Catholic, and Anglican, the sect moved its headquarters several times all over Germany and the lowlands. And this went on until the late 18th century. They first sent a colony to Suriname in South America, whose governor was a patron and possibly a member. Suriname, to this day, is a repository of weird sects, like the Moravian Brethren, the Moravian Brethren, who are truly bizarre Protestant sect. There's a wonderful, great writer, Richard Price, who's specialized in the history of Suriname. He's got a couple of books in which he's talked about this period. Very, very well written, very interesting books about the Maroons of Suriname, the runaway slave communities of Suriname, and the weird Protestants, and the whole thing. So anyway, that didn't work out because he was murdered in 1688, and the colony removed to Bohemia Manor on the Chesapeake, where the first of their settlers had already proceeded. Bohemia Manor had been patronized by Augustine Hermann, a sympathetic landholder from Bohemia, whose son was a member, but who later repudiated the sect without being able to reclaim his property. The leader of the colony from 1683 was Peter Sluyter, who seems to have been a religious confidence man of the type that would bedevil religious communalism throughout its history in America. Sluyter died rich and dissolute in 1722. The colonists, over 100 people, on the other hand, lived lives of the strictest poverty, chastity, and obedience. Men and women were separated for meals and worship. The day and much of the night was spent in hard labor, silent or chanted prayer and meditation. Diet, clothing, all living conditions were as ascetic as could be borne, and all proceeds sent into a common fund controlled by Sluyter. Before his death, the land was distributed and private property permitted, but all profits still went to the common fund, and the community life remained just as onerous. Between 1727 and 1730, the colony broke up, and during the next 10 years, the churches in Europe returned to the Dutch Reformed Church. On trips through the Rhineland and the lowlands, Penn invited all German Quakers, Mennonites, Anabaptists, and other pietists, these being extreme left-wing Protestant sects, to migrate to his new land. The first to go was a large contingent of German associates of the Society of Friends, the Quakers. They were shortly followed by Mennonites, and then by the apocalyptic millenarian disciples of Johann Jakob Zimmermann, who died on the day his followers were to sail. Leadership was assumed by his first lieutenant, Johannes Kelpius, Kelpius, an extraordinarily learned man, deeply read in philosophy, mysticism, and theology, both orthodox and occult, and an acknowledged Rosicrucian. Kelpius proved his Labadie maybe, Kelpius definitely, Rosicrucian. Kelpius proved his powers by stilling the waves in a violent storm. The colonists debarked at Bohemia Landing and went on to the neighborhood of Germantown on June 24, 1694. According to Zimmermann, the apocalypse was only 3 months away. The colonists celebrated Midsummer Night with rites that were a strange mixture of occultism, paganism, and pietist Christianity, and soon set out about building the Tabernacle of the Woman in the Wilderness, crowned by the Rosy Cross, the symbol of Rosicrucianism, to the astonishment of their simpler or more conventional neighbors. The mystical number of 40 colonists settled down in their 40-foot square building to watch and pray and await the coming of the rebirth of the world. Kelpius set himself up as an anchorite in a nearby cave, and that cave, at least when this little article that I've seen came out in the 1930s, that cave was still to be seen. It was marked with a rosy cross carved into the outside, somewhere near Germantown. Pennsylvania. I'll try to track down that article and give you the. This strikes me would be a wonderful pilgrimage site, right? To go to this cave, maybe even drop a hit of something. The community of both men and women was strictly celibate, and life was at least as ascetic as amongst the followers of de Labadie. They differed primarily in their much greater learning, even sophistication. In fact, it would be well into the 19th century before any religious communist colonies would recruit such cultivated people. They have been called superstitious, but indeed they were anything but. There is a vast difference between the superstitions of the illiterate and the occultism of the overeducated, says Rexroth. The tiny colony endured till 1748, 1694 to 1748. And before that period, its cultural influence on Pennsylvania was out of all proportion to its numbers. They produced the first book of hymns to be published in America, and many other examples of the earliest printing, including a study with vocabulary of the Lenni Lenape Indians, whom they believed to be one of the lost tribes of Israel. The first book of its kind to be done in English America. These were the first people to study an American Indian language. They taught school and were in great demand as skilled craftsmen and builders, even architects. Time was spent in hard labor, choral and solitary prayer, meditation, and, unlike other such groups, in the study of the classics of mysticism and occultism, from Hermes Trismegistus to Meister Eckhart, Jakob Böhme, and the Kabbalah. Curiously enough, their interest in astrology and alchemy led them to chemical and physical experiments and to watching all night through their telescopes for the signs of the second coming. It's a lovely image. A direct line stretches from them to the scientific activities of latter-day Philadelphia, made famous by the experiments of Benjamin Franklin. The great weakness of the woman in the wilderness, and by the way, their own name for themselves was the Contented of the God-Loving Soul, but people called them Society of the Woman in the Wilderness, was the shortfall of their prophecies, beginning with Zimmermann himself, who said that the millennium would come at the autumn equinox of 1694. The date passed, and the second coming had not come. Also, they believed they would never die, but Zimmermann died before they set out. The precociously brilliant Kelpius died at age 35 in 1708, and the last leader, Conrad Mattei, in 1748. By 1750, the community had been absorbed into the general society of Quakerism and German pietism, on which it left traces which endure to this day. In 1720, a certain Conrad Beazle and 3 companions left Europe intending to join the woman in the wilderness. When they reached the colony, they discovered that Kelpius was dead. Most of the members had left, and those who remained were lost in contemplation, while the tabernacle fell into ruins around them. These people later went on to found a colony, an intentional community called Ephrata, which is still in existence. It's no longer a purely communist society, but there are still some of the original descendants of the original inhabitants living in Ephrata, which I think is also in Pennsylvania. And so the influence of Kelpius and the Hermeticists was strong in this group, although they were not nearly as learned. They did carry on looking through telescopes for the end of the world, signs of the end of the world. May be added to this very day, for all I know, but there are still Ephratans, and they're still practicing a kind of Amish or Mennonite-like agriculture out there in Pennsylvania. So the woman in the wilderness had a direct offshoot which survived for a very, 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 very long time, and in fact even today, although it's probably as moribund as the Shakers or some such group as that, it's not exactly a major influence on American life. But these ideas and images were injected right into American society right from the beginning. 1694 is pretty fairly early, and if we think that Dee and Raleigh and those people were already involved in ideas like this, then it begins with the very beginning of the English influence in America. And if we wanted to study the Spanish situation, we would probably discover that not all of them were vulgar conquistadors interested only in ripping off the Indians for their gold. What was all this about the Fountain of Youth, for example? Whose idea was that? Where did that come from? So even the Spanish, who are because we learn history from the English point of view, are always depicted as these like hideous materialists, unlike the noble English. I don't think that was true either. So Hermeticism goes right to the roots of American settlement. So that's really the first part of this lecture, and yeah.
Which woman are they referring to?
Well, I've been trying to track that down. I'm not exactly sure, but I think it must be Hagar in the Bible. Hagar, the slave wife of Abraham, who's sent out into the desert with Ishmael. In other words, they felt themselves going into exile as Hagar was thrust out of the community of Abraham. I think that's what it means, but I intend to look into that more thoroughly. It's very interesting that the name. I love the name, the woman in the wilderness. It just says it all. It's wilderness, the woman, and wilderness. Whereas the overview of history is male and culture, this is female and nature. So this in one beautiful phrase, this symbolizes the whole underground stream of mysticism in American history. And in fact, it has historical resonances for me. For example, the woman in the wilderness is a wonderful description of poor Anne Hutchinson after she was thrown out of Boston by the Puritan bastards, and had to, in the middle of very bad weather, as it happened, had to wander out of Massachusetts on her own with a few of her followers, many of whom were women, a disproportionate number of whom were women, and eventually ended up in Rhode Island, where they also were eventually chased out probably by Roger Williams, who was not the wonderful liberal that he's made out to be, but in fact was a bit of a tin pot dictator in his own right, and ended up in Pelham Bay, where unfortunately some Indians who mistook her for a Dutch person killed her. They were having wars with the Dutch, and even though Anne Hutchinson was very pro-Indian, obviously there was a communication problem, and she was murdered, much to the satisfaction of the Boston Puritans, who published a pamphlet glorying in her death, in which they referred to her as a familist, F-A-M-I-L-I-S-T, which is a very interesting reference. And I've just been reading about the family of love, which was a prominent largely 15th century sect of radical Protestants, although they survived well into the 18th century, 17th at least, probably 18th century, as a separate sect. And the family of love had two very interesting aspects about them from my point of view, from the point of view of this lecture. One is that, unlike the other radical Protestants, they thought it was all right to lie to avoid persecution. They didn't think it was worthwhile being burned at the stake by either Protestants or Catholics, and they gave themselves permission to lie and to go to whatever church it was necessary to go to. In Europe, they went to Catholic churches. In England, they went to Anglican churches. And what really annoyed the hell out of the Protestants when they came to power was that, you could never pin these people down. They wouldn't get up like the Protestant martyrs in Fox's Book of Martyrs, and say, "Yeah, I'm a Protestant, kill me." They didn't do that, and that's very interesting. They practiced this permissible dissimulation about their beliefs, which makes their influence very difficult to trace in history, needless to say. The other interesting point about them, it makes it difficult to trace, but also whenever you hear that word familist, you have to look close to see whether it's just whether it's a propaganda lie or whether there really is a family of love or some related sectarian activity involved. The other interesting thing about them is that they also were pretty learned compared to, say, the Ranters or the Diggers, and were very into Hermeticism. They read the works of Boehme, they read the other Hermetic works, and were probably yet another conduit of bringing Hermetic influence into the New World. The American Puritan authorities were obsessed by the family of love. They thought they saw a family of familists everywhere. They thought that Anne was a familist. I don't think this is true, actually, in a literal sense of the word, although she may have been influenced by them. But there probably were real family of love agents floating around America and spreading Hermetic and left-wing Protestant doctrine. Another image called up for me by the phrase "woman in the wilderness" comes from the so-called captivity narratives. If any of you have really gotten deeply into early American lit, you might have come across some of these very fascinating documents that were amongst the very first books written and published by Americans in America. And it was a whole subgenre. It was like sort of, we have romance and science fiction and stuff like that. This was like a little subgenre of American lit. And what it was first-person narratives by people who had been captured by Indians and later on rescued or escaped. Captivity narratives. I don't know how many of them there are. There's a good number of them. You can read about them in a wonderful book called Redemption Through Violence by... I'll get the title for you. The author, Redemption Through Violence, is a wonderful, wonderful study of early American literature from the point of view of these images of wilderness versus culture and violence versus spiritual realization and so forth and so on. That's what I mostly know about these captivity narratives from that book. I haven't read a lot of them myself. They fall into two categories. One is the people who are really glad to have been rescued or to have escaped from the Indians, who are going right along with the Puritan line that the Indians are devils, and they were raped, they were, scalped, everything bad happened, it was just awful, and they're so glad to be back in good Christian civilization. Another subgroup of texts within this group of texts, however, was produced by people who were not particularly glad to have been rescued. And in fact, the Puritans and the Americans themselves were extremely aware of the fact that for years not one Indian was converted to the European way of life, whereas innumerable Europeans either voluntarily went to live with the Indians or else were captured and then stayed, even when they could have been rescued or released or traded hostages or whatever. There was a whole bunch of white people who really became, I mean literally became Indians, married into Indian tribes, took Indian names. In a lot of cases when they had been captured as children, they forgot even how to speak English, and violently resisted being rescued by the Puritans. And one of Cotton Mather's most fascinating witchcraft cases, in fact the first one that he was involved in, was a woman who fell into this category, who had been seized by Indians and later on rescued by white people, and clearly did not want to be rescued, had wanted to stay with her Indian family. And subsequent to being rescued and brought back to Boston, began to experience all kinds of what we would call paranoid schizophrenic symptoms, which Mather interpreted as witchcraft, possession, and began a whole series of exorcisms, which would seem to work, and then she would have a relapse, and they would do it again, and then she would relapse again. I forget whatever happened to this poor woman in the end. I think Mather probably drove her to her grave. It was Mather who coined the term, which I love, invisible warfare. It was his view of what was going on between the Indians and the whites. It was not just an open, and the witches, the Indians and the witches and the heretics and the family of love and Anne Hutchinson and, wicked women and black people and red people, all those alien others on the one hand, and we good white Protestant men on the other. Between them was not just open warfare, it was also invisible warfare. There was a spiritual warfare going on. And Mather's struggle for the soul of this woman was very much, in his mind, a part of that invisible warfare. And so, again, Woman in the Wilderness conjures up for me the image of these women in the wilderness, real women, living, live, happy women who liked being there. They weren't all women either. I mean, there were men too, but for some reason, a lot of these captivity narratives were produced by women, and it's also, therefore, this literature is of great interest to feminist theorists now, and the whole relationship between their position, their inferior, let's face it, shitty position under white men in Boston, and the really very different position that they had with their Indian adopting, the tribes of Indians who adopted them, which was not at all a patriarchal society in the way that the Puritans were. Yeah, it was not a feminist society, don't get me wrong, but savages are often a lot more, a lot better for women and children and gays than so-called civilized people. As we know now, homosexuals had recognized positions in American Indian tribes. If you were queer in 16th, 17th century Boston and had a chance to be captured by the Indians, by God, you would be so much happier. You would, and I'm sure that there probably were some homosexuals and lesbians among the people who didn't want to be rescued. I can't prove that. It's just an assumption because these things were simply not discussed, as you know. But it's an assumption that I make, and I don't think I'd be too far wrong in making that assumption. Another area in which I see the concept of the woman in the wilderness emerging over and over and over again in American history would be in what we could very loosely call nature mysticism. Again, you had the Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was an anti-nature mystic. The Puritans were anti-nature mystics. Wilderness, remember, was a howling wilderness inhabited by devils. But not all early Americans saw things this way. Very clearly, I spoke last year about Thomas Morton of Marymount, who got together with the Indians and built a maypole, and they danced around the maypole, and he was introducing them them to classical paganism, and they were introducing him to Native American paganism, and they were having a great time when suddenly, who showed up but the Puritans, and arrested Morton and persecuted him and drove him out of the New World. He went to England, where he published his side of the story in a wonderful book called New Canaan, which is really wonderful and funny. I think it's the first really funny and enjoyable work of American literature. Morton, Thomas Morton, immortalized in Nathaniel Hawthorne's story, The Maypole of Merrymount, which some of you may have read. Although he doesn't use the name Morton, he for some reason gives him another name. But that's in case you've read that story and thought it was Hawthorne making it up. It isn't. It's a literally true story. One of the most fascinating incidents in early New England history. And Morton was pro-wilderness. I mean, he enjoyed being out in the woods. He liked the Indians. He got along better with them than he did with the Puritans, and he says so in his book. He makes no bones about it. I don't know whether I'd call him a mystic. Clearly, there were some, pagan overtones to his thinking, neo-pagan, let's call it. But later on, we will find that there were that this spirit of the wilderness definitely takes on a divine mystical quality for a lot of American writers, artists, and of course ordinary folks who don't necessarily produce any texts or paintings to memorialize their thinking. I think we can probably, if we studied the captivity narratives, we would probably find seeds of this nature mysticism. If we look at even such a, in many ways, unpleasant character as Jonathan Edwards, one of the late Puritan preachers whose work everyone is forced to read in high school. There is elements even in his thinking which are beginning to tend towards nature mysticism, and finally, of course, where does nature mysticism really take off is in Boston with the Transcendentalists in the early 19th century, which we'll talk about next time when I get to the radical mystical movements in the 19th century, which is the next big active period for all this in America. So I don't want to go too deeply into that now. Besides, I fear that I'm really running out of time. Yeah, right. So let me just sort of conclude here rather quickly by reminding you of Frederick Jackson Turner's famous frontier hypothesis of American history. Turner was a great historian of the early 20th century. He came up with this idea of sort of a Hegelian dialectic in American history between the settled civilization, the frontier, the narrow band of in-betweenness, and the vast wilderness on the other side. And as long as that frontier moves, according to him, you get a dialectical tension which is resolved. I mean, I won't go into this in great detail, but the upshot of it is as long as you have that moving frontier in American history with culture on one side, nature on the other, and that in-between stage, which he called the frontier, but which we could call some kind of in-between state of consciousness, as long as that situation persists, then democracy, in his thesis, is strong. In other words, it's the experience of that in-betweenness, that ambiguity, that constant kinetic thing of always being on the move, of thinking as your culture is a moving culture, a moving thing rather than a static thing. That's what feeds in a kind of Walt Whitman-esque way vitality back into the culture. And for us, that culture is democracy. It's egalitarianism. It's has a lot to do with a lot of radical Protestant values about equality in the eyes of God, expressing itself in actual social structures, which we call democracy, and which were very much on the minds of radical Protestant revolutionaries in the 1770s. And that idea which really comes out of the woodwork into the light of day for the first time in American history, this thing called democracy. I mean, We could critique it, but let's accept it now in its positive in the positive valuation that Turner gave to it. As long as you have a frontier, that enrichment, that mirroring back of the spiritual power of the wilderness that mirrors itself back into the culture and provides this kind of psychic strength that allows democracy always to be always changing, to be always fresh. What happens when you reach the end of the frontier? What happens when that line, reaches the Pacific Ocean and stops? What happens to democracy? If the New World is the thesis and the frontier or wilderness is the antithesis, and democracy is the synthesis, which would be another very Hegelian way of looking at it, then what happens when the triplicity is the triplicity of the dialectic is no longer in place? What happens when one of the terms is knocked out? When the in-between term, in fact, is knocked out? When there is no more frontier, there is no more movement, there is no more possibility of change? What will happen to democracy? I think it's a very interesting question for us to ask ourselves. And what about all the other dichotomies that involves? And I made a list of them. Dark and light. You have the dark forest, and as the Puritans called it, the city on the hill. Boston was the city on the hill, bathed in the divine light. Nature and culture. The wilderness and the city. Woman and man. On the one hand, Indians, blacks, and as I like to say, the Irish, and on the other, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Magic on the one hand, science, rationality on the other. Anarchy on the one hand, order on the other. In between all these dichotomous terms, there's a slash mark on my piece of paper. What is that slash mark? What does it represent? It's the hermetic in between. From that slash mark comes the hermeneutics that we want to look for. The hermeneutics that will explain what Turner or Whitman called democracy, what I'm calling liberty. The terms are not important. It's not so much a specific thing in history that we can pinpoint, that we can find examples of, that we can say this man was a Democrat or a Libertarian, this woman was a Democrat or a Libertarian, and this one wasn't. There is not so many places. I've looked for a few places where we can actually do that, just to show you that it can be done. But there aren't that many. It's more of a feeling. It's more of an intuitive thing. In fact, it's ambiguous. In fact, it's in between. It's very hermetic. It never resolves itself into the logos. It's always an image, right? So, in looking for a hermeneutics of history and trying to uncover this ambiguous third term, what we're also looking for, I think, is the illuminating fact, or what I call the poetic fact, which may or may not be literally historically true. Some poetic facts are myths, but they're believed by a lot of people who then act on the basis of that belief, so they do, in fact, take part in history. And this is something that rationalists always want to block out, that the myth is an extremely powerful, potent participant in history because people believe in it and because people act on their beliefs very frequently. Not always, but frequently. So, in looking for a hermeneutics of liberty, which is probably the most ambiguous term in the whole American language, what we're really looking for at one and the same time is our founding myth and our most occult secret. Thank you.